Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. This is Ashley Halliday-Schmant, and I am the director of the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness. I'm here today with Ryan Hannon, and we're going to talk about coordinated entry in a rural context, but also really focusing in on what it would take to make your street outreach program housing focused, and how that can in a rural context as opposed to in an urban setting. So here we are. There's Ryan, and he also, Ryan, do you want to share your Twitter handle if people want to tweet you?
Sure, that's on the next slide with our photos. And not necessarily, you could tweet if you'd like, tweet me or tweet yourself. I think that all homeless awareness is good, so please feel free to share or tell us how bad we're doing.
Are you seeing the next slide?
I do see it now, yes.
Okay, it's just a little bit of a lag. Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, so that was us. A little bit more about our region, just to give you some context. We're working in the Northwest region of Michigan, so the biggest city being Traverse City, but our coalition is covering a 10-county region. And within those 10 counties, 5 of the counties are an independent jurisdiction with HUD, and so we have 5 IJ counties and then 5 balance of state counties that make up part of the 61 counties of the Michigan balance of state. Very rural in nature. Like I said, Traverse City is our biggest city by far, and it in some respects acts as kind of a hub for services and things like that, but every region has kind of its own center that folks can access. It's kind of the main hub for accessing services. So it's a little bit about where we work. The session goals, we want to review what coordinated entry looks like in our system, and we think that it works pretty well in rural settings, with the 3 access points being the call center, shelter, and street outreach. We want to make sure everyone can get an understanding of coordinating as a system to provide an efficient approach to ending homelessness. That's something we pride ourselves on in Northwest Michigan. Over the years, we've really worked tirelessly, I would say, on coordinating, collaborating, and working as one team, even though we all, or many of us, work for different agencies. And then, like I said before, we want to focus on what it could look like to deliver housing-focused street outreach. So coordinated entry basics. I think I have presented this at every summit for the past 4 years, so I'm not going to go way into it because please, I hope everybody by now knows. However, just some grounding in coordinated entry. These are the 4 main areas. We need to think about access. So access meaning your initial engagement point. The first place that folks experiencing homelessness are accessing your homeless service system. In our region, like I said, that can be the HARA through the call center, street outreach, and that in our region is done by Goodwill of Northern Michigan or the HARA. They also have street outreach providers, or shelter. Then we want to think about assessment. So the process of documenting the housing needs, preferences, and vulnerability. We're doing outreach at this level. We're doing triage and in-depth diversion services. Then we want to think about prioritization. Ryan will talk a little bit about this as well around housing-focused street outreach and prioritization of that caseload. But when we're thinking about prioritization in the context of the system, we want to think about making sure the folks with the highest needs are having access to housing first. And then, of course, referral, matching people to available and appropriate community resources, housing, and services. So this is how the flow of coordinated entry looks in our system. I think a few of the steps can be changed up here and there depending on your system, but this is a really general way it looks. So step one, a person requests housing services. And I should say at step one, that's step one for every single access point. So if someone's accessing through the HARA or street outreach, it's going to look the exact same. So someone reaches out requesting housing services. We're going to attempt diversion. So street outreach workers are doing diversion, call center staff is doing diversion, shelters are doing diversion. Next, we're going to do some triage and housing assessment. Then we'll do housing referral. Often this housing referral is going to also look like a street outreach referral. So depending on where someone accesses the system, they could start with street outreach or they could get to street outreach at step 4. And I only say that because that's kind of the focus group or this session today. Then street outreach is providing housing navigation and placement and going into housing programs. Ron, did you want to talk about our little guy here?
Yes. So thanks, Ashley. If we could, if I could mention there at step 1, we think about people, their initial request for housing services. They may show up at a shelter or call the central intake line. I wanted to point out here, our little guy here, for those of you who don't know, who aren't sports fans, but if you're Lions fans, you might recognize this many times throughout the game is pass interference. So I wanted to point this out because to highlight the fact that street outreach runs interference in people's lives. So there are people out there that don't ask for help, that maybe don't call the line. So we have to go out to them and do what I call run interference in their lives, meaning we're coming to intervene, talk with them, build engagement, and try to help them engage in services and really look at the possibility of access to housing. So that's what our little guy there is about.
Okay. Next, these are some roles within the coordinated entry system, so staffing roles. And these are just different options that you can think about within your coordinated entry system. Over the years, our system has had every single one of these at different capacities, I would say, depending on funding and depending on need and where we were at in building on our system. But these are pretty standard best practices of roles to have within your system. We have coordinated entry call center staff doing all the things that I talked about in the beginning. We have street outreach, again, doing all the things we talked about in the beginning. We have housing navigation, that's referral to housing programs, document readiness for housing programs, eligibility, some housing location services, depending on how your system is set up. In the greater Grand Traverse region, well, actually throughout our entire 10-county region, we've combined the title of street outreach and housing navigator into one position. So street outreach is not only acting as an access point in our system, but they're also doing housing navigation. And we'll talk more about what that means, right, to be housing-focused street outreach workers, but we've actually combined titles here to make it very clear that street outreach is in fact responsible for housing-focused services. A housing locator is another position some folks fund throughout their system, so that's someone looking for housing, doing landlord recruitment, things like that. We have our housing-based case management team, landlord relationships, case management in housing once people get housed or referred to their program. Diversion case managers, creative problem solving and avoiding entry into the system. And then you want to make sure you have oversight of all these things. So depending on your level of organization within either your local planning body, if you're part of the balance of state, or within your independent jurisdiction, some level of oversight and governance of the entire coordinated entry system is key in making sure everyone's working together and services are consistent among all access points. Okay, Ryan, you can take it away.
Okay, next. The slides are a little delayed here. Mine is still on the rolls.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's
Putting
okay.
street
I just
outreach
wanted
to
to
work.
point it out there, and other people some people may see the slides faster than others, but here we are. We got putting street outreach to work in your community. We talked about access points, and a lot of times street outreaches or maybe in your community, street outreach, either you don't have street outreach or it's not recognized as one of the 3 main entry points to coordinated entry. If so, congratulations to you guys. If not, it's really important to look at it this way, because like I said earlier with our pass interference guy, there's people that aren't showing up for help. There are people literally who don't want to be found, if you will, from most of the time other people, because they want to remain safe, right? But I also remember the last time the census came around, which would have been 2010, right? The census workers wanted me to take them directly to the camps and where people were. And I said that, there's people that think the government's out to get them. If I bring them to you, they're going to, I'm going to be ineffective with what we do. This year we had a much more, well, of course, COVID hit, but it was a much more focused and intentional way where we can work with the guests ourselves and kind of promote it beforehand. So that was good. But there are people out there that need street outreach to come and connect with them, to be able to help them access this system. And street outreach, we're out and about, we're out in the community, we see lots of things. We're really the eyes and ears on the ground, if you will. And we think about how important that is. If we're not housing focused in nature, then what are we really there for, right? Are we just going to leave these folks out there? When I first started doing outreach, it was when I took over the program, it was literally, like it says here, focused on distribution of things. It was handing out things, giving people rides randomly to places. And I noticed back then that, these folks here on the streets had no access to housing. So literally started connecting them with housing. So it's really important to be housing focused in nature, not focusing on the distribution of goods. However, we do recognize that people need items, right? They need things to survive. What I found in my experience is there's lots of other people in the community who are willing to do those things. So kind of keeping them on the same page or advertising, if you will, in the community, these places where people can go to get those basic needs met. And then certainly there are times where it's warranted, where you would give somebody something, but it certainly isn't the focus of our work. Things like maybe someone's extremely suffering from extreme mental health issues, and they really, one woman I worked with would not come in anywhere, literally wouldn't come in anywhere. And over time, I helped her access some things like new underwear, hats and gloves and things like that. Over time, we were able to build engagement and work toward housing. But at the time, I couldn't say, hey, go to this drop-in center and get stuff, because she wouldn't go. I mean, I could say that, but she wouldn't go. So that's a situation where what we would call is warranted. And then tracking in HMIS, like the reason that's so important, some of you guys may know this, but certainly tracking what we do to show the funders the work we're actually doing out here. But it really shows, it may seem like it's never ending and tedious, and is anyone ever going to look at this data? And I can assure you it is. And it really, we tell stories and highlight things we do in the streets and people we serve. But it really comes down to it is that hard data of what's going on out there to the decision makers, the funders, or whoever it may be, how important it is. And the more accurately we can reflect that through the data, the better it is for people. It may seem like we're not helping people, but every time you record your contact or record something you're doing with a client is so important. I had one comment at I think it was a COC meeting one time about a chronically homeless woman who got into housing. It was a shared housing situation, but we made a referral for a security deposit. I think it was a higher up somewhere and said, "Oh, that woman you were meeting with," and I explained, like, I think I met with that woman like 100 times before we got to that point. And so a lot of people that aren't doing street outreach don't remember or don't recognize like how much it takes to do this work. So I could say I met with this woman 100 times and that's going to, get forgotten. But when you look at HMIS and you see all that stuff, that really can reflect on how much work it really takes to be able to do these things. And moving on here to being persistent around housing and engagement, but trauma informed. I don't know if you guys ever saw there was a documentary, it was on Dateline, I think, and they talked about homelessness stuff, and they had Mark Horvath was on there, and there was this one gentleman who was doing street outreach in LA County, I think it was, and he took the reporter and the camera guy to this treehouse thing, and there was the woman who was living in this treehouse wasn't there anymore. She had gotten housed, but the outreach worker told America or the world, whoever was watching this, the reporter asked him, "How did you make it work for this woman?" Because he described chronic homelessness. About this woman was reluctant to engage, was chronically homeless, had severe mental health issues. And when he was asked, "How did you make this work for this woman?" he said, I get teared up when I say this because it's hard to express to people what this is. He said, "I came back and visited her once a week for 5 years before I was engaged into housing, but it's important to be persistent, to continue to do that, even if it takes 5 years. And the trauma-informed part is on the client's terms, right? Be respectful, announce, say, "Hey, I'll come back next week," and then you come back next week. It's really important. So we know that the people we serve, I guess the thing I've noticed, the only common factor between everyone I've ever served in the past 13 or 14 years, besides being human and homeless, is trauma. Trauma in their life, somewhere along the way or multiple times. So it's so important to be trauma informed, but to not give up. All right. We can go on to the next slide. So what street outreach is. This, I think, is a real definition from somewhere, maybe HUD. Essential services related to reaching out to unsheltered, homeless individuals and families, connecting them with emergency shelter, housing, or critical services, and providing them with urgent non-facility-based care. So we talk about being housing focused, right? And we are. But sometimes you have to help somebody get into an emergency shelter. And that's okay too, but we don't leave it there, right? We're still sticking with this person for housing. Long-term housing is the goal. We don't want to keep running into people or reaching out over and over again if they can get into housing. When we think about, when Ashley was talking about street outreach and housing navigation as one title, the reason that is I was asked by somebody to give can you write up what street outreach is. I literally couldn't do it without talking about housing navigation. Like, we have to go out to people and bring the resources to help end their homelessness to where they are. That's what this is about. Folks oftentimes may go in and out of shelters, especially if it's a street outreach, or a winter, if it's a night-by-night shelter. It looks like we have a question there.
We do. How are you collecting HMIS information during engagement? iPads, paper, pen, clipboard, laptop?
Those are all good methods. So all of the above. When I first started, it was paper and pen. Then I met a man named Jerry Leslie, and he convinced me to use an iPad. So I did that for a while, but now what we use now is Microsoft Surfaces. I don't want this to be a commercial for that, but it works really well, okay? But a tablet, some of our team does use little like mini laptops, something you can use a touch screen. We can do documentation paperwork right on the screen. Um, Even sign the HMIS forms right on the computer. That some people that might be a barrier, right? So we do have paper forms, but we collect that data when we're out in the field. So sometimes it depends on what's going on where you're at. You may keep a list, a paper list of what you did that day, and then put it in your computer at the end of your shift back at the office or in your car. Or you can do it after each interaction, depending on what's happening. And we may go into a large encampment and get a lot done, and then go back and tally like the service transactions. But HMIS data, when we're doing entries, housing stuff, we'll do it right there in the field. Or, if we're meeting with them somewhere, like they may be at the library. So we use a hotspot on our phone to connect. So we have internet service, and we are rural, and most places we do actually have internet service. So there are a few spots where that's not so strong, where we can do it paper-based and then enter it later.
And I think that's a really good question. I want to jump in here too, because it's a system question. About 2 years ago, well, maybe 3 now, our entire system, so housing providers and outreach providers, we made all of our documents that we could electronic. So if you have somebody that knows how to do that and can invest the time, I think it was a game changer. It made our housing-based case managers more efficient with their time. It made our street outreach workers more efficient with their time. And then, like Ryan said, we invested in tablets or iPads or whatever, but like the Microsoft Surface is great. Our housing-based case managers have like smaller versions of a laptop that can flip over into a tablet. So folks can just sign with their finger right then and there. It's cutting down on time that your staff is going back in the office and doing data entry. And then, I mean, yeah, we're, like Ryan said, we're not necessarily logging service transactions right then and there in front of the client, but it cuts down on the need for paperwork. Folks experiencing homelessness and unsheltered homelessness primarily don't have access to mail a lot of times. So I've heard of rural areas across the country having access be really surrounding like filling out of paperwork, and that's not making sense for people who are living outside. So as much as you can get electronically that you can really just bring to people out in the field, I think is critical.
Absolutely. And we know it works. We have one of our sources here for CEUs, right? We have to have sources. Well, I found one here that talked about housing first. Does it really work? And this article talked about the folks that were given housing first interventions, right? People who score high on the SPDAT, and they're recommended for housing first. Those folks who got into housing through housing first spent 73% of their time in stable housing, compared to 32% of people who didn't have the intervention that needed it. And to me, as we see Daymond Johns here, that's an investment even Daymond Johns can be a part of, right? If you guys ever watch Shark Tank, and he's probably the most sharkest shark of them all, right? Even he can get down with housing first. So we wanted to talk about that and how important it is to bring resources for housing right to where people are. Even the most vulnerable or people where everyone else in the community will point or deem as unhelpable or service resistant do well in housing. I don't know how many times that I have heard that with people in the community that they didn't want help, or they're resistant, or they're banned for behavior that we've actually housed and are doing successful. It's amazing to me. So here we have, this is right from Ian DeYoung in his book on ending homelessness. And it talks about street outreach and which approach do you use? Approach one, which is contact and survival focused. Remember, we did talk about that a little bit before. People do need things to survive, right, when they're out there. But is that really the focus of our outreach? As an outreach or a well-established outreach, if you're kind of known as a homelessness expert in your area, those charities giving out stuff will listen to you and they'll help. They'll be able to help those folks, so you don't have to. But what it's generally understood as is making contacts, addressing immediate needs, and transportation. Sometimes it happens, especially during COVID. Now you may see a lot of things are shut down. What I've been able to adapt to here during COVID, we had day shelters, they shut down, and that's normally where people would get kind of stuff like this. We have one charity that opened back up, but the hours and times are different. That gives out free clothes and stuff. But then the day shelters, they're all volunteer based. So the ones we've coordinated together. So there are some volunteers from each of these places that are willing to still help. So they'll gather and inventory and get stuff that people need, and then they'll bring it to one location, which is a drop-in that kind of we've set up in our community at the winter shelter. That way people can still access that stuff. Now, this contact and survival focused approach is really useful for locating and knowing every person outside and keeping people alive, as well as responding to crises and having a visible presence often, many hours of the day, many days of the week. You think about being seen out in the community. I was in one community I was helping, this was down in Florida, helping them train and coach their street outreach team. And it was a county run street outreach team. And part of the reason they were not effective is because each kind of ward of the county, each county commissioner was calling up the street outreach people saying, why don't I see street outreach? I want them over here. And because they were county funded, they kept having to just be running all over the place based on what county commissioner was complaining the loudest. And that really isn't effective to ending homelessness, right? We talk about prioritization, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and being targeted. You can't do that when that kind of stuff's going on. So you may not be seen all the time. Staffing in this approach is usually low-skilled, entry-level, or trained peers. Now, there's certainly a place for trained peers that can help, but we have to remember street outreach and intervening to end homelessness is a professional duty. Contact and survival focus struggles with solving homelessness, struggles with meeting the needs of people with complex and co-occurring issues, and then demonstrating outcomes. I remember when I first started doing this program was established already here where I worked. And I remember the outcomes were really how much stuff you gave away. And that didn't seem right to me. And it's not that way anymore. We use approach 2, or with COVID, maybe a little bit of a hybrid here. Like COVID has really done a lot and screwed a lot of things up in communities. But I really found partnering with those charities or ministries or organizations that provide basic needs, they can really help and come, even if they're not open as much, they'll rally around the needs of people experiencing homelessness on the streets. So approach 2, focus on the homeless solution. It's housing focused. So it's generally understood as intensive, assertive, and housing focused. So it's busy. There's a lot of paperwork. You got to time things you got to get done. It's good for, or really useful for, problem solving and ending homelessness. You think about if you've ever had to give someone a sleeping bag coat or a sleeping bag or a tarp and they're going to go sleep outside. Like, that really gets your mind going about problem solving. Like, how long can this person sleep out here this way? We don't want that. We're the ones who intervene to help end that. Staffing is highly skilled, usually higher education and many years of experience. I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but I've been doing this a long time, and so there's lots of experience, and I'm glad for that. And I'm glad I'm here to pass it along to you guys. What we struggle with in the housing solution, housing focused street outreach, is demands of caseload. There's lots of people. Expectations of others, seeing is going slow, right? We hear it from all over the place, even clients. Hey, you're not helping me fast enough. So we explain again the process and the system. Housing providers, COC, like, hey, you guys aren't doing fast enough. Well, to do it right, sometimes it takes a little while. We want it to be as soon as possible, right? But there's a lot going on out there. So it may be as soon as possible for the next person on the list, but not people farther down. And then we also struggle with solving issues that require input from other systems. And I don't know if that's so much what we struggle with. We see that in this approach, but it's more of a limitation of the system. So that's kind of why I participate in the COC and the work group so much, is to help the system get better for the people we serve. And then interacting with other systems. It seems like no matter what, every interaction with any other place, if you're experiencing homelessness, it doesn't go well, or it doesn't go right, or it takes longer than we would even as people who are housed. For example, I know this has gotten better through some great advocacy around the state, but trying to get an ID for somebody. I remember one time taking a woman to get her ID at the Secretary of State, and we went there and presented and had our stuff, and the clerk said, like, for one, the clerk was talking to me, not the client, so it was very awkward. So I had to point out, well, what do you think, person, right? And that can be very undignified for the people you're serving. But then we had the stuff, and the lady said, well, you don't have enough here, what you need. And I thought that I did, and I knew, like, if we talked to a manager, then that manager would most likely say, yes, this will work for this case. And it did, but I had the wherewithal through many times of doing this to be able to do that. But if it was like a regular housed person, we wouldn't have had to go through that. Those are the dynamics, and the system set up masses, but a lot of times the people we serve fall through the cracks. So we struggle with that in outreach sometimes. Or I'll tell you a story about, it's this same lady. The lady I took to the Secretary of State is the same lady I was giving an example of that I had to help get the underwear and the sleeping bag. Wouldn't go into places, and still won't. But we got her ID, and we went through that process. We got the ID, and I mean, this woman was very paranoid and needed my reassurance every step of the way for a food stamp card and everything, that it was going to be okay and I can give this information. So we went through this whole process, got her ID, it came in the mail, and it had someone else's picture on it. And it was like, of all the people that this could happen to, it was this person. Thankfully, she trusted me through the rapport that we built, through doing what I was going to do every time, even if it was nothing, showing up when I said I was going to show up. It didn't deter her. We were able to get it worked out and got her ID. But it's just like solving issues that require input from other systems we struggle with. Okay. Let's go on to the next one. If it hasn't switched for you like it hasn't for me, I think I have it printed out here. Necessary skill sets for effective street outreach. Oh dear, I didn't know you were using that picture, Ashley. But I'm joking because we don't ever take pictures of clients. This is actually my friend Tom is an actor who trained in Minnesota officers. He dressed up like this and trained officers for critical intervention and mental health crisis in the state of Minnesota. So he lives here and he volunteered with me years past, and he agreed to act for us so we can have some promotional photos. So that's what you see here. So our slide necessary skills for effective street outreach is the capacity to navigate multiple complex service systems. We know, and then for those of you doing this work, you know that the people we serve touch all the systems. The criminal justice system, mental health system, substance abuse, the hospital, police, all the time, over and over and over again. We have to help people access Medicaid and food stamps, all that stuff. So we have to be able to navigate these multiple complex systems and be persistent and professional in our interactions with each other. Mental health first aid is a wonderful training to have, so you can recognize the crisis people are going through and help them through that. And of course, what I like to say is bring the conversation back to housing. Using a harm reduction approach. This may kind of go against company policies or funders or board. Your board might not agree with this, right? Harm reduction is so important. A recent client we were working with was drinking non-palatable alcohol, right? And it was so bad, it was like, we think he was having dementia because of the way he was acting from drinking this stuff. So after talking with him, it wasn't all us, right? But our approach is like, what can you do to get at least like some vodka, right? Like having that conversation and in partnership with our federally qualified health center, this man is now drinking palatable alcohol and we can have an intelligent conversation now. But that, like, you may not realize, or you may think that's not productive, but we couldn't get anywhere with this guy. The police were calling me sometimes 3 times a day all around town about this man. And actually, the other night when we had 5 inches of rain in 24 hours, so the people out there sleeping rough got drenched. It dropped to 30 degrees that night. A lot of people that have gear and camping gear can survive all that, but this guy did not. So it took a partnership with the police and emergency services and street outreach to help this guy make it through the weekend. But having that conversation of, hey, why don't you drink regular alcohol, or how can that happen? And he does a thing where he picks up cans and returns them, right? Like that's reducing harm in his life. And of course, trauma-informed approach. Whenever I enter a camp or approach somebody, I ask permission. Hey, can I enter? I announce myself. One of the best practices is having being identifiable, right? Like you can see there in the photo, I got my badge. Like it's kind of weird for me to wear that thing, but it's showing the people I'm approaching that I'm a professional person, right? I'm not just a random person who's coming up and may give them harm. It's hopefully showing to them that this can be a trusted person. This is outreach coming. A lot of times I'll do that with my voice, especially in the woods, because you may not be able to be seen or see the camp right away, but it's there and you can see some stuff, and you announce yourself so there's no surprises. As we talked before, the trauma people have gone through, everybody's gone through it, and some worse than others, and even may continue to go through it. There may be someone that's coming and assaulting somebody every night in their camp or where they're sleeping. We do not want to trigger that. We want to be announcing and let them know that we're safe. Person-centered care, of course. The client, right? They have to agree and have buy-in to this. and they have say in what happens. So we do a lot of motivational interviewing to help with that. Overdose first aid is another thing. Some board members or organizations may not be keen to, but it's so important to be able to know what to do out there. You may be the only person that comes along and sees this person there, and if they're ODing, if you don't have your kit, it could be the difference between life and death out there. Documentation, we talked about that in HMIS. It's so important, especially if you think about it, if you've ever had a situation where some housing programs came up, but you had to be chronically homeless, and the client you're working with, you knew, maybe you didn't document all the times. If you don't have that documentation, it could really have implications for housing for them in the future. So it's so important. And then also, like I said before, the decision makers or funders, HUD, whoever it is, they don't see the people out there through what they see, which is HMIS. Less resources come for the people you need to help end their homelessness. And of course, focusing on ending homelessness. People are stuck in survival mode. Even when they've been there a long time. A guy I talked to today, actually, he's been living rough all summer long. He said he had a bed. He was on a list for a veteran, transitional housing. But he hadn't had contact with them since January. And when I was talking to him today for the first engagement, I hadn't seen this guy. I saw him, I think, once earlier this summer and then this week only. And he had some questions and we talked through some stuff. And it started with COVID related and then winter shelter stuff. And it's like, hey, what's your plan on housing? Like, knowing or even assuming that he doesn't have a plan, just putting it that way. Not like, hey, I can get you a voucher. It's, hey, what's your plan for housing? We may not know. And then they talked about not having a phone and not having access to be able to call this place back. So even in the early stages or survival needs talk, if we can find a way to focus in on ending homelessness, people don't want to be out there. They want to off the street. Even, like I said before, the people that many communities may look and say they want to be homeless because they don't realize it, but it's our job to help figure out the way that's going to help people get the help they need. Okay. Understanding unsheltered homelessness. I'm getting texts. I'm making sure it's not Ashley or Rebecca here. Okay. In rural areas. So we think about unsheltered homelessness. This is also from the book on ending homelessness by Ian. Can generally be categorized into 3 buckets. One and done. Someone who's there for a short time. Housing-focused outreach workers should not spend a significant amount of time with this group. One and done, tumbleweeds, and anchors. So one and done, it's someone who falls into homelessness, but they get out quickly. Our prioritization, our triage tools can help us to identify people like this. Traverse City is a rural area, but it's very tourist, right? Many of you may have come here on vacation or for a visit for our sandy beaches or our beautiful rivers or trails. I ran across a guy one time who's actually had a sign, a cardboard sign, and it said, help, I'm homeless or something like that. And so people kept calling me, hey, or sending me, people will send me text pictures of people they see like this. Oftentimes it's not someone who's experiencing homelessness, especially during the summertime. People will actually travel and ask for money during the Cherry Festival. Well, I came across this guy and he said he was from Seattle or something like that. And he lived in a commune or something like that. And him and his commune friends went to Maine for a music woods festival. And on the way back, their bus broke down and he was trying to get back. And he said he was sleeping right over there in these trees. Right? And I was like, okay. So I believed him, right? But as a good street outreach person, I'll come back the next day and check, right? See if he's still there. He said he was just trying to get enough money to get back home, but he wasn't homeless. Sure enough, he wasn't there and never saw him ever again. So I didn't spend too much time with that person. Maybe that wasn't a very good example here in this scenario, but that's what came to mind. But people that can do it on their own, we don't want to get in the way of that. Then there's people that we can categorize as tumbleweeds. This is why we must have an open data system. I'm so glad we do in our 10 counties, because I can see if someone's been working with somebody in Manistee, Cadillac, or Petoskey area, and then we can touch base and talk about it. So tracking is key for this group across county lines and even state lines. Now, we can't necessarily see that across state lines, but tumbleweeds are people that move around a lot. Even it doesn't necessarily have to be state to state, but people kind of go where they have resources. Sometimes maybe I'll have a friend in this county, I'll try it over there, and then they're in the woods over there. I had one guy who was living in a campground over by the Grand Traverse Resort. If any of you know where that is, it looks like the giant like milk carton thing in Traverse City. Well, then I think we had a referral or somebody, a phone number came and talked to the guy. And then when I talked to him the next day, he was in Frankfort, Michigan, what I call the edge of the earth. If you ever drive there, you go up this big hill and you can see nothing but sky and water, then the hill goes down. It's a beautiful area, but he was camping over there the next day. I was able to get there and help him, get him on the list and into shelter, but some people move around. Then anchors, typically people experiencing chronic homelessness. They may be, as Ian would talk about in a city, they may be on the same street corner or bus stop thing, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Those are typically people experiencing chronic homelessness. Around here in rural areas, we might see that. There's a couple guys that have kind of deep in the woods encampments, and they're there over and over and over again, and their camp never moves because they're so secluded. We know where they are, and we keep visiting them. This slide is a good one, how to spend your time as an outreach worker. This one was very eye-opening to me when I first heard Ian talking about this. 70% of our time should be housing focused for actively engaged. People we're working with, we're gathering their documents, we're recertifying their homelessness on the HCV list. Maybe they're on our by name list and they need permanent supportive housing, whatever it is. We're continuing to look for housing for them or for the program. We have sometimes where we have housing programs where folks get into the program, but there's no housing identified. So if we're out and about talking to people, word of mouth, by the way, seems to be the best way to find units before they're posted. We can send that lead along to that housing program. And there's nothing wrong with, giving a partner agency a housing lead, especially if they, are going to house the people you serve. So 70%, that's most of your time doing things necessary for housing for the folks at the top of your list. 20% engaging service-resistant people. So those are the ones we came back once a week for 5 years, right? You incorporate a little bit of time into that to your day. And then locating new people. So we often don't just roam around looking for people. We're grateful for the call center and our community partners like the police who tell us about new people, and then we'll go and try to get them connected. But we don't spend a whole lot of time looking for people. That could be very time consuming, especially when there's so many woods out there. All right. I'll spend a little time on prioritization. If you can go back one slide. Ashley, it looks like there's a
question that has come in. Where can I get the book on ending homelessness by Ian DeJong?
orgcode.com, I think it is, the website, and you could probably Google it, I think. Maybe, I'm not really sure.
You can just Google it, and then Ian has like the publisher's website. I'm not sure if you can buy it on Amazon yet, but if you just Google the book on ending homelessness by Ian DeJong, you'll go to the publisher's website and you just order it online.
It's also available on Google Play and Kindle. My coworker John just informed me. He's new. I hired him a couple weeks ago, and while we were waiting for his background check to clear, he said, "Hey, is there anything I can read?" I said, "The book on ending homelessness," and he went and found it and read it. So it's worth the investment, and you could share with your friends. I think, Rebecca, was there a question earlier that I missed? I was thinking.
No, there was just someone having technical difficulties.
Oh, very good. So we see our time here, 70% of our time is for housing focus for actively engaged. Now, when we talk about prioritization, when I first started, I first started doing the full SPDAT as an outreach worker before there was even a VI SPDAT. It changed the way I did outreach, right? It identified the people that they may sit in the corner and never say anything at a community meal or a drop-in center, or walk down the street or under the bridge, never asking for anything. Sometimes those were the most vulnerable people out there. So triaging and prioritizing the most vulnerable really is the way to go. But you can't just be actively engaged with people who are easy to engage, right? They may not be the most vulnerable. We certainly want everyone to get help, but we're best able to end homelessness by reaching the people that need us most first, and empowering the ones that don't need us as much to help solve their own issues. And that's where, the coordinated entry system and COC and our homeless response system really comes into play and can be really beneficial. Even times we may do a VI SPDAT out there in the field, and maybe their score's low, and we're talking about trying to find the best housing intervention that works for them. And it may be little to no help, and they may be discouraging for someone to hear that. Then we can turn it into a powerful, empowering conversation. Sometimes we'll help people sign up for a housing choice voucher, and they'll be reluctant, like, "Oh, it's going to take forever." It's like, it might. If you're still in this situation, I'd be glad we did this today. But then we talk about ways that they can get their own housing, especially if they have some income. We talk about shared housing, rooms for rent. Like, the end of homelessness doesn't have to be an apartment all the time, right? We know that people can be successful. Okay. We'll go to the next one. I don't know if you guys can see it yet. I made Ashley go backwards. But the image there is pretty important for my conversation. There it is. Pro tips. Okay, here's, if you don't remember anything that we say all day long today, other than prioritization, remember this. It's okay to sit on a log. We have to accept people where they are. Go to them. Sometimes it's sitting on a log. And certainly listen. It's amazing how often we, and certainly people who don't know our system, think they know what people need, right? If you're outreach workers, you've been doing this a while, you probably get more knit hats and homeless survival kits than you know what to do with, right? Well, what happens with that stuff? People don't necessarily like knit hats because they're not very effective, and they're bulky and heavy to carry around. Homeless survival kits, maybe they only need one thing that's in that kit, right? They can't carry around everything, and it gets wasted or tossed or whatever, and we don't have time to do that. So what I do when boxes of homeless survival kits show up at my office, I have a volunteer break them down and separate them into piles of like things and take them to drop-in centers or wherever, so people can access them where they're at. And then, like, if someone really needs let's say, for example, a can of bug spray, if they really can't get it or are so reluctant to go into a day shelter to get one, I can grab one and give it to them, right? But that, I don't know, I probably handed maybe 3 cans of bug spray out myself in my whole entire time doing this, right? Listen to what people need. They'll tell you. If you ask them, they'll tell you. most of the time, right? Some people are even reluctant to accept help. Maybe they've been raised in a way it's ingrained in them that you don't do that. That's for people in need, even though they're sitting there in need. But really listening to people. And then accept their decisions, even if they're not desirable, even if it's not what you would choose. Like, people have choices. I remember there was a woman who died in the spring of exposure. Shortly after COVID hit and the winter shelter closed down, she died of hypothermia. She came in, of all winter long, she slept rough except for about 10 nights of the winter shelter. One night she came in and she dumped her backpack on the ground, right inside the shelter, middle of the floor. She said, I don't know what to do all of this stuff. People just keep handing me food like all day long. She had a backpack full of food she wasn't going to eat. What she needed was a house, right? Her health was very bad. And I secured her a bed in the other shelter and she wouldn't go. And she passed away of hypothermia, even though she had choices. Even though there were people in the encampment offering to help her. It's really hard sometimes. We can't make people do things. This may be a bad example of accepting individuals' decisions, right? But we have to meet people where they are and accept them for who they are and where they're at in order to help them get off of the streets. When you're interacting with folks, maintain your normal tone. Sometimes I'll see volunteers or even workers in the field talk louder to people because they're homeless. It's the oddest thing. They're not hard of hearing. They're just homeless. Why do we have to talk to people louder just because they're experiencing homelessness? It doesn't make any sense. It makes people feel awkward and gets in the way of engagement. And then just being with people, being comfortable in the silence. I talked to actually a young person today who's in a housing program waiting for a unit. And this person, our youth team hasn't had contact with in probably 2 months, maybe. It's been difficult with COVID. The day shelter was down for a few weeks. And he came in. I said, I need to talk to this guy, right? I identified myself, told him who I was, asked him if he remembered me, asked if he remembered the team. And he didn't answer right away. He looked at me at a blank stare for about 10 seconds after each question. Then he would answer it. Oftentimes we feel like we need to fill that space with talking. It's okay to listen or just be. It's okay to sit on a log. If someone is angry, they may take it out on us. Don't take it personal. Experiencing homelessness, especially unsheltered, is tough. It's terrible. It's energy draining. And people, you may be the only person who actually listened that day. Don't take it personal. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I'll say this. There was one guy lived in his van for 4 years with his wife. It took me 2 years to actually engage with them. Repeated going and visiting over and over again, yelling, telling me I don't want no effing help, right? But knowing they didn't want to live in that van. Then once engagement hit, it took 2 more years to actually get into a permanent supportive housing program. We prioritize. That's what we do. This person, they lived in their van. Their life was hard. But it was a little bit easier because they were in a car, right? We tried 3 different housing units that didn't work out. Finally, the 4th one worked out, and there was the person was denied by the management company, so we had to appeal. I explained all this to this person. All you had to do was sign this appeal letter and to be able to move on into housing. And even after explaining and knowing, when I showed up that day, he was having a bad day and he yelled at me and told me to F off and took that piece of paper and crumpled it up and threw it. I said, okay, and I picked up that piece of paper and I left. I came back the next day. I said, you ready to sign the letter? And he said, yes. And I uncrumpled it, smoothed it out, and he signed it, and he moved into housing. But I can't be upset at someone who's upset because homelessness is terrible and they've been wronged by every system they've ever touched their entire life. We got to come back. And then it's okay to go deeper. This trauma piece, so many times, even grown men that I'm working with may tell me years later or years after knowing them how they were abused as a child. Like, we don't dig for that, right? When we're doing our full SPDAT, we don't need to know the details. And we can say we don't need to know details. They may share more. It's okay to go deeper. That brings us to our last slide here. All housing are different. Everyone's house doesn't have to look the same. Let's get from homelessness to housing. Street outreach workers are so important. Go ahead. There's a question, I think.
All right. Do you consider numerous housing options when solving the housing crisis? Like, do you have options for those who want to live alone or in a community or other arrangement? Not everyone wants their own apartment.
That's a good point. Not everyone does. Some people do want their own apartment when it may be more appropriate for a group setting. But we cannot predict who's going to be successful where. Right? But we definitely want to incorporate choice as much as possible. Sometimes someone may be in a housing program, but the units, the only one you can find, sometimes for a month or 2 or 3 at a time, doesn't work for them. We've shown, we've proven by experience, when we kind of force somebody into a unit they really don't want, they don't stay. Choice is so important. Ashley, you got more on housing to end homelessness?
Sure. I think I just want to kind of leave people with a few things to sum up what we've talked about today, and really the things that we want to hit home. So partnership being a huge one in the work to end homelessness. Partnership within your local planning body or within your COC. So we look at street outreach as equal partners as the call center staff, as the housing-based case management staff, as the COC leadership staff. So partnering with each other and then partnering with other systems. We really want to think about where folks experiencing homelessness, what other systems they're contacting the most, and how we can make intentional and actionable efforts around outreaching to those intersection points and making sure that folks are connected. You want to make sure also we're being tireless advocates for ending homelessness. If one of the, I think, critical points in Ian's book related to street outreach is how you spend your time. So that pie chart, and really examining that as a street outreach worker or as just someone in your system. How much of our system's time is spent doing different things? And how much of your time as a street outreach worker is just handing people things and not focusing on housing? So if we really are honest with ourselves in what that looks like, we can think of different strategies to get to the housing focused street outreach work. And Ryan mentioned it a few times, but letting others in the community be the givers of the things, right? So like maybe a charitable organization isn't going to go out to an encampment and give things, and maybe you don't want them to, but they can give it to you and you can help people access it. Or like Ryan said, giving it to you and putting it at a drop-in center where people can get it if they need it, not pushing it on people. And then making sure your outreach providers are connected with the larger system. I think this has been huge. I think sometimes Nothing against outreach workers, right? But they're sometimes on their own, right? They're out doing work that nobody else is really doing. They're out in the woods, in the trenches with folks doing this really difficult work. And we don't want to make them other than. We don't want them to be disconnected from the housing programs. They need to have just as strong of a relationship with the housing providers as they do with the referrals to street outreach.
If I could add to that, Ashley, it's so important, like Ashley said, to be strong partners with your housing programs. We're the face of it out there with the people we're serving. We have to help the clients build faith in these programs. If we don't do that, we've failed as outreach workers. That's why it's so important to be strong partners and know these housing programs. We may have to educate the clients, like tell them like what this means. What is it? One time I visited a guy under a bridge and he said, the first time I met him, don't you want me to go to treatment? I said, well, I'll help you get there if you want to, but I'm here to help you get some housing, right? You don't have to be sober to get housing. And how that right there increased our rapport greatly. And then starting to share with him, build, I guess, legitimacy with the housing programs. Like that's one of the main functions of our job, is to help people have faith in these system and these programs.
Okay, and I think that's all we have as far as content. I'll just do one more kind of plug for Ian's book. I have no like interest in him making money or something, so don't think that. I think they should make money off it. But the book is great, and so it's great for your system. It's great for all your staff to read, because what it really is kind of a compilation of all of the trainings that Org Code gives. It's not just a book on someone rambling on about a narrative around homelessness. It offers real solutions and real tools that your system and your staff can use. So I just really want to focus on that. I think we're looking for solutions a lot of times, and we don't have places to go, and that's a great resource for your team. And I think that's it, unless we have any more questions.
I want to say one more thing going on about like giving out stuff. Some people think they need to give things to be able to engage with folks. When they know you're a helper and you want to help them end homelessness, that usually works. You don't have to kind of buy rapport to engage. Some people may need help, right? And you get them underwear, like I said, right? Because they really need it and they will appreciate it. And it's a great honor, I guess, to be like in that sacred space of such a private thing if someone needs in a dignified way. But you don't need to give stuff for people to engage with you. If you really explain and you're there and realize they don't want to be there, they'll work with you most of the time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ryan and Ashley. We all really appreciate your experience and knowledge in this field. As a reminder to everyone, if you are planning on receiving CEUs for this session, you do need to sign out in the chat for CEUs, just so I know that you've been here the entire time to receive credit. I'm also going to share the last slide. So thank you for attending. Please help us improve by completing the post-event survey. All videos will be available within a few days. So keep checking your inbox for details. It will likely be an email from Jason Weller. All right, thank you, everyone.
Bye.